The scream that tore through the mountain canyon that February morning in 1876 was the kind that made even the eagles fall silent. Samuel Xavier had been tracking a bull elk through the pine forests above Oro Blanco, Arizona territory, for the better part of 3 hours when he heard it. The sound cut through the crisp mountain air like a blade through butter, full of such raw anguish that his massive frame froze mid-step, his weathered hand automatically reaching for the rifle slung across his broad shoulders. His long dark hair, tied back with a leather cord, shifted in the cold wind as he turned his head sharply toward the source. At 32 years old, Samuel had spent the last decade living alone in these mountains, trapping and hunting, preferring the company of the wilderness to the complications of civilization. His muscular arms, built from years of hauling game and chopping wood, tensed as he listened. Another cry followed, weaker this time, filled with a grief so profound it made something twist in his chest. Samuel abandoned his hunt immediately, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly through the snow-dusted underbrush. He moved with surprising grace for a man of his size, his 6'4" frame navigating the terrain with practiced ease. The February sun filtered through the ponderosa pines, casting long shadows across the rocky ground as he descended toward the sound. What he found in a small clearing made him stop cold. A young woman knelt in the dirt beside a shallow creek, her entire body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Her long auburn hair had come loose from its pins, falling in tangled waves around her face and shoulders. She wore a simple calico dress, now torn and dirty, and her hands were covered in mud. But it was what lay wrapped in her shawl, cradled against her chest, that made Samuel's breath catch. He could see the tiny, still form, could see the way she held it with such desperate tenderness, could see the blood on her skirts and the pale, exhausted cast to her face. "No, no, no," she was whispering, rocking back and forth. "Please, God, no, not my Hope, not my baby girl, please." Samuel had seen death before, had seen it in 100 different forms across these mountains. But this particular kind of heartbreak struck him differently. He stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to approach or retreat, his usual self-assurance deserting him. The woman seemed unaware of his presence, lost entirely in her grief. Finally, he cleared his throat gently and took a cautious step forward. "Madam," she didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear him. Her sobs continued, interspersed with whispered pleas and broken prayers. Samuel moved closer, his boots crunching softly on the winter grass. "Madam, I'm here to help." This time she looked up, and the expression on her face nearly broke him. Her eyes, a deep green even reddened with crying, were filled with such devastation that he felt it like a physical blow. She was young, probably early 20s, with delicate features now twisted in anguish. Tear tracks streaked through the dirt on her cheeks, and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. "She's gone," the woman finally managed, her voice hoarse and broken. "My hope, my baby." She never even took a breath. "I felt her go still inside me yesterday, but I thought maybe I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong. But then the pains came this morning and I couldn't get back to town, and she came so fast and she's just gone." The words tumbled out in a rush, each one cutting deeper. Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest, some wall he had built over the years crumbling at the sight of her pain. He lowered himself to his knees beside her, his large frame settling carefully into the dirt. "I'm Samuel," he said quietly. "Samuel Xavier, I live up in these mountains. Let me help you." "Grace," she whispered. "Grace Thorne, there's nothing anyone can do. She's gone." Samuel looked at the small bundle in her arms, at the tiny perfect fingers visible at the edge of the shawl, and felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm so sorry," he said, and meant it with everything in him. "I'm so sorry." Grace's face crumpled again, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was supposed to protect her. I was supposed to keep her safe. But I couldn't. I failed her before she even had a chance." Without thinking, Samuel reached out and placed one of his large, calloused hands gently on her shoulder. "You didn't fail anyone. Sometimes these things happen, and there's no reason or sense to it. It's just cruel and wrong." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw surprise flicker across her features, as if she had only just realized a stranger was kneeling beside her in the wilderness. But instead of pulling away, she seemed to lean slightly into his touch, as if she desperately needed any anchor in the storm of her grief. "Where's your husband?" Samuel asked gently. "Where are you staying?" Grace's expression hardened slightly, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "There is no husband, just me and a dream that turned to dust." Samuel absorbed this information without judgment, his hand remaining steady on her shoulder. In the wild frontier, he had learned that people's stories were complicated, often painful, and rarely simple. "You came out here alone." "I was staying at the boarding house in Oro Blanco," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working at the general store, saving money, trying to make a life. I woke up before dawn with the pains and I panicked. I thought if I could just get to the creek, get some water, maybe it would help. I thought I had time. I didn't know she was already gone. I didn't know it would happen so fast." Samuel's heart ached for her. The thought of this young woman, alone and frightened, stumbling through the pre-dawn darkness while her body labored to deliver a child already lost, was almost more than he could bear. "You're out here by yourself, going through this. That's not right." "Nothing about any of this is right," Grace said, her voice breaking again. "I was going to name her Hope because that's what she was. My hope for a better future. My hope for a family. My hope for love and happiness and all the things I never had growing up. And now she's gone and I don't know what to do." The sobs overtook her again, violent and all-consuming. Samuel did the only thing he could think of. He moved closer and carefully, slowly, wrapped his powerful arms around both Grace and the tiny bundle she held. He half expected her to push him away, to reject the comfort of a stranger, but instead she turned into his chest and wept as if her very soul was shattering. Samuel held her there in the dirt beside that creek, his strong arms creating a shelter against the world, his broad chest absorbing the force of her grief. He didn't speak, didn't try to offer platitudes or empty words of comfort. He simply held her, his chin resting gently on top of her head, his massive frame curved protectively around her smaller one. The February wind whispered through the pines, and the creek babbled softly beside them, and Samuel Xavier, the mountain man who had spent a decade avoiding human connection, held a broken stranger and felt something shift fundamentally in his heart. Time seemed to stop in that clearing. Minutes could have been hours for all Samuel knew. He barely noticed the cold seeping through his buckskin clothing or the way his knees pressed into the hard ground. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the unimaginable loss she was enduring. Eventually, Grace's sobs began to quiet, though her body still trembled. She pulled back slightly, just enough to look down at the bundle in her arms. With shaking hands, she carefully pulled back the edge of the shawl, revealing a tiny, perfect face. The baby was so small, so delicate, with wisps of auburn hair and features that looked like they had been carved from porcelain. "She's beautiful," Samuel said softly, and he meant it. "She looks like an angel," Grace whispered. "My little Hope, my angel." They sat there together as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, two strangers bound together by grief and circumstance. Finally, Samuel spoke, his deep voice gentle. She deserves to be laid to rest proper, somewhere beautiful and peaceful. Grace nodded slowly, her tears falling silently now. I don't know where. I don't have family here. I don't have a plot or a cemetery or anything like that. There's a spot, Samuel said, thinking of a place he often went when he needed peace. Up on the ridge overlooking the valley. There's wildflowers in the spring and you can see for miles. The sun hits it just right in the mornings. It's the most beautiful place I know. Grace looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. You would do that, for us, for a stranger. You're not a stranger anymore, Samuel said simply. And yes, I would be honored to help you give your daughter a proper resting place. Something flickered across Grace's face, a momentary easing of the anguish. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you. Samuel stood, his muscular legs unfolding beneath him, and then reached down to help Grace to her feet. She swayed when she stood, and he caught her quickly, one arm wrapping around her waist to steady her. She was clearly weak, her body having just gone through the trauma of birth, and Samuel could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Can you walk?" he asked. "My cabin is about 2 miles from here. We can get you cleaned up, get you some food and rest, and then we'll see to your daughter." Grace looked uncertain, her arms still wrapped protectively around the bundle. "I don't want to leave her." "You won't have to," Samuel assured her. "We'll keep her with us, keep her safe. But you need to take care of yourself too. You've been through something terrible and you need rest." Grace seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. "All right." The journey to Samuel's cabin was slow and difficult. Grace could barely walk, her legs shaking with every step, and Samuel ended up carrying her for much of the distance, his powerful arms cradling her gently while she continued to hold her baby. He moved carefully through the forest, choosing the easiest paths, murmuring soft reassurances whenever Grace's breath hitched with renewed grief. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was simple but well built, nestled against the side of the mountain with a clear view of the valley below. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, evidence of the fire Samuel had banked that morning before heading out to hunt. He pushed open the heavy wooden door with his shoulder and carried Grace inside, setting her gently on the edge of his bed. The interior was sparse but clean, with rough-hewn furniture and animal skins on the floor. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and shelves held various supplies and equipment. It was clearly the home of a solitary man, built for function rather than comfort, but it was warm and dry and safe. "Let me build up the fire," Samuel said, moving to the hearth. "Then I'll heat some water so you can wash." Grace sat on the bed, still holding hope, her eyes distant. Samuel worked quickly, building up the fire until warmth began to fill the cabin, then fetching water from the barrel outside and setting it to heat in a large pot. He moved around the space with practiced efficiency, his muscular form surprisingly graceful as he went about these domestic tasks. When the water was warm, he poured it into a basin and brought it to Grace along with clean cloths. "I'll step outside while you clean up," he said quietly. "Take your time. There's a clean shirt on the hook there if you want to change." Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "You're very kind. I don't deserve such kindness." "Everyone deserves kindness," Samuel said firmly. "Especially now, I'll be just outside." He left her alone, stepping out into the cold February air and pulling the door closed behind him. He stood on the small porch, his hands gripping the rough wooden railing, and took several deep breaths. The image of Grace's grief-stricken face, of that tiny still baby, was burned into his mind. He had thought himself hardened to the harsh realities of frontier life, but this had shaken something loose inside him. When Grace finally called for him, her voice small and hesitant, Samuel found her sitting in his oversized shirt, her torn and bloody dress in a pile on the floor. She had washed her face and hands, though her eyes were still red and swollen. Hope lay on the bed beside her, carefully wrapped in the shawl. "I don't know what to do," Grace said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to let her go." Samuel crossed to the bed and knelt in front of Grace, his large hands resting gently on her knees. "You don't have to let her go completely. She'll always be part of you, always be in your heart. But we need to lay her body to rest, somewhere she can be at peace." "I'm so scared," Grace admitted, tears welling up again. "I'm scared of burying her and walking away. I'm scared of forgetting. I'm scared of tomorrow and the day after and all the days stretching out ahead of me without her." Samuel felt his own eyes burn with unshed tears. "I know you're scared. But I promise you, you won't face tomorrow alone. I'll be here. I'll help you through this." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, seeing perhaps for the first time the rugged, weathered face with its strong jaw and kind eyes, the broad shoulders and muscular frame that spoke of strength and protection, the long dark hair that framed features marked by sun and wind and years of solitary living. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, searching for the right words. "I've been alone in these mountains for a long time," he finally said. "I thought that was what I wanted, what I needed. But seeing you there this morning, seeing your pain, I realized something. Being alone and being lonely are two different things, and I've been lying to myself about which one I was. You need help, and I need to help you. Maybe that's reason enough." Fresh tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but there was something different in them now, something beyond just grief. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Samuel replied. "Just rest for now, gather your strength. When you're ready, we'll take Hope to that place I told you about and we'll say goodbye properly." Grace reached out and placed her hand on Samuel's weathered cheek, her touch light and tentative. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me, for not looking away." Samuel covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm engulfing her smaller one. "I see you, Grace Thorne, and I'm not going anywhere." They stayed like that for a moment, an unexpected connection forming between two people thrown together by tragedy. Then Samuel stood, clearing his throat. "I'll make you something to eat. You need to keep your strength up." He moved to the small kitchen area, pulling out supplies and beginning to prepare a simple meal. Grace watched him work, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to process everything that had happened. Just this morning, she had been alone and terrified, giving birth in the wilderness to a child she already knew was lost. Now she was in a stranger's cabin, wearing his shirt, being cared for by a mountain man with gentle hands and kind eyes. Samuel prepared a simple stew with dried venison and vegetables, working with the efficiency of someone used to caring for himself. As the food cooked, filling the cabin with savory smells, he also made coffee, strong and dark. When everything was ready, he brought Grace a bowl and a tin cup, settling onto a stool near the bed. "Eat," he urged gently. "Even if you don't feel like it, your body needs nourishment." Grace picked at the food at first, her appetite non-existent, but Samuel was patient and persistent, and eventually she managed to eat a decent portion. The warmth of the stew seemed to give her some strength, and a bit of color returned to her pale cheeks. "That was good," she said quietly, setting aside the empty bowl. "Thank you." "My cooking's nothing fancy, but it keeps a body going," Samuel said with a small smile. He took the bowl from her and returned it to the kitchen area, then came back and sat on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Can I ask you something?" Grace nodded, her eyes on the bundle beside her. "How did you end up here? In Oro Blanco, I mean." "You said you don't have family here." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn quilt. "I came from Missouri," she finally said. "St. Louis. I was working in a factory there, living in a boarding house with 6 other girls. It was crowded and dirty, and the work was hard, and the pay was barely enough to survive. Then I met someone. A man who promised me the world, who said he loved me, who said we would get married and have a wonderful life together." Her voice turned bitter. "He lied about everything. Turned out he already had a wife and 3 children back east. When I realized I was pregnant, I went to him thinking he would help me, that maybe I had been wrong about the wife. But he just laughed. Told me I was a fool and that I had gotten myself into this mess and I could get myself out of it." Samuel felt anger stir in his chest, a protective fury toward this man he had never met. "He's a coward and a liar." "Yes," Grace agreed softly, "but I was a fool. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I wanted so badly to think that someone could love me, that I could have a real family, that I didn't see the truth right in front of me." "That doesn't make you a fool," Samuel said firmly. "That makes you hopeful. There's nothing wrong with that." Grace looked at him, surprised. "Most people wouldn't see it that way. Most people would say I got what I deserved, having a baby out of wedlock. Most people are harsh and judgmental about things they don't understand," Samuel replied. "I'm not most people." A ghost of a smile crossed Grace's face. "No, you're certainly not." She continued her story, explaining how she had saved every penny she could and bought a ticket on a westbound stage, hoping to disappear somewhere where no one knew her story, where she could start fresh. She had chosen Oro Blanco almost at random, drawn by the promise of work in the growing mining town. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Patterson, had been surprisingly kind, asking few questions and helping Grace find work at the general store. "I thought I could do it," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I thought I could have my baby and raise her on my own and make a life for us. I had been feeling her move, feeling her alive inside me, and I thought everything would be all right. I was scared, but I was also excited. I had hope." "Hope," Samuel repeated softly, understanding now the full weight of the name. "And now she's gone and I don't know who I am anymore," Grace whispered. "Everything I planned, everything I dreamed about, it all died with her." Samuel reached out and took Grace's hand, his large fingers wrapping around hers. "You're still Grace Thorne. You're still a woman who was brave enough to cross half the country alone, who was strong enough to survive in a hard world, who loved her daughter enough to give her a beautiful name and a chance at life. That doesn't go away just because the world was cruel." "I don't feel brave or strong," Grace said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I feel broken." "You are broken right now," Samuel acknowledged. "And that's all right. What happened to you today would break anyone, but broken things can heal given time and care. I know that for a fact." Grace looked at him curiously. "How do you know?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his thumb unconsciously stroking the back of her hand. "I came out here 10 years ago running from my own pain. My wife and son died of fever back in Texas. I thought if I could just get away from everything, hide myself in these mountains, I could forget. Turns out you can't forget, not really, but you can learn to carry the grief. You can learn to live around it." Grace's eyes widened. "You lost your family." "Mary and Jacob," Samuel said, the name still difficult to say even after all these years. "She was 26, he was 4. They got sick one winter and were gone within a week. I couldn't save them, couldn't do anything but watch them slip away." "I'm so sorry," Grace breathed. "Here I've been so wrapped up in my own pain, I didn't think about what you might have suffered." "Everyone's pain is their own," Samuel said gently. "Mine doesn't make yours less. I'm just telling you so you know that I understand at least a little bit. I understand the weight of grief. I understand the feeling that tomorrow seems impossible. They sat together in the quiet cabin, two wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Can we do it now?" Grace asked suddenly. "Can we lay her to rest before the light fades?" Samuel nodded. "If you're ready." "I don't think I'll ever be ready," Grace said honestly. "But I don't want to wait. I want her to rest somewhere beautiful, like you said. I want her to have peace." Samuel stood and helped Grace to her feet, then rummaged through his belongings until he found a small wooden box he had made years ago to store supplies. He emptied it carefully and lined it with soft rabbit fur. "Will this work?" he asked gently. Grace looked at the box, at the care Samuel had taken to make it comfortable and warm, and fresh tears spilled over. "It's perfect." Together, they carefully placed Hope into the box, arranging her tiny body with tender reverence. Grace tucked the shawl around her daughter, making sure she looked peaceful and warm. Samuel found a handful of dried wildflowers he had collected the previous summer and laid them around the baby, adding small touches of beauty. When they were finished, Samuel closed the lid gently and picked up the box. He looked at Grace, who stood wrapped in a blanket over his oversized shirt, her feet bare and her face pale but determined. "You can't go up the mountain like that. Let me find you some things." He located a pair of his old trousers, which Grace had to cinch tight with rope to keep them from falling off, and thick socks that came up to her knees. He helped her into his spare coat, which hung on her like a tent but would keep her warm. Finally, he wrapped her feet in leather and fur, creating makeshift boots. She looked almost comical in the oversized clothing, but she also looked cared for, protected. "Ready?" he asked softly. Grace nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Ready." They left the cabin as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Samuel led the way, carrying the small box with infinite care, while Grace followed close behind, her hand occasionally reaching out to grip his arm when the path grew difficult. He moved slowly, checking on her frequently, making sure she had the strength to continue. The climb took nearly an hour, winding up through pine forests and across rocky outcroppings. True to his word, Samuel brought them to a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The view was breathtaking. Below them, Oro Blanco nestled in the distance like a collection of toy buildings, and beyond that, the desert stretched out in rolling waves of red and gold. The sky was painted in brilliant colors as the sun continued its descent, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and sage. "Here," Samuel said softly, stopping in a small clearing ringed by ancient ponderosa pines. "This is the spot I was thinking of." Grace looked around, taking in the beauty of the place, and something in her face eased slightly. "It's perfect," she whispered. "She would have loved it here." Samuel set down the box carefully and went to retrieve a shovel he had strapped to his back. He selected a spot beneath the largest pine tree, where the ground was soft with fallen needles, and began to dig. His powerful muscles worked steadily, his breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. Grace stood nearby, watching, her arms wrapped around herself. When the hole was ready, Samuel straightened and looked at Grace. "Would you like to say anything?" Grace knelt beside the small box, her hands shaking as she opened the lid one last time. She looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, memorizing every detail, every tiny perfect feature. "My sweet Hope," she said, her voice breaking. "You were loved from the moment I knew you existed. You were wanted and cherished and dreamed about. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry you never got to see this beautiful world, never got to run through fields or laugh or feel the sunshine on your face. I wanted to give you everything, and instead all I can give you is this place, this beautiful, peaceful place where you can rest." She paused, tears streaming down her face. I promise I won't forget you. I promise you'll always be in my heart. I promise that every tomorrow I'll face with the strength you gave me, even if you never got to take a breath. You made me a mother, even if only for a little while. Thank you for that gift. Rest now, my angel. Rest and be at peace." Samuel felt tears on his own cheeks as he listened to Grace's words. When she finally closed the lid with shaking hands, he carefully lowered the box into the ground. Then he and Grace together pushed the soft earth back into the hole, covering Hope's tiny grave. When it was done, Samuel arranged stones in a circle around the spot, marking it carefully. "We'll come back in the spring," he promised. "We'll plant wildflowers here, make it beautiful for her." Grace nodded, unable to speak, and then she collapsed. Samuel caught her before she hit the ground, his strong arms sweeping her up against his chest. She clung to him, her body racked with sobs, and he held her there on that mountain ridge as the sun set and the stars began to emerge, holding her through the worst of her grief, being the anchor she desperately needed. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "I promise, Grace. I've got you. You're going to get through this. We'll face tomorrow together." Grace buried her face against his broad chest, her tears soaking into his shirt. "I don't want to leave her here alone." "She's not alone," Samuel said gently. "She's surrounded by beauty and peace, and we'll come back. We'll visit her. She won't be forgotten." They stayed on the ridge until full darkness fell, Grace crying in Samuel's arms while he held her with unwavering strength. Finally, when her tears had subsided to quiet hiccups, and her body had gone limp with exhaustion, Samuel lifted her into his arms and began the careful journey back down the mountain. Grace drifted in and out of awareness during the descent, vaguely conscious of the steady rhythm of Samuel's heartbeat beneath her ear, the warmth of his body against the cold night air, the sure-footedness of his steps even in the darkness. She felt safe for the first time in months, protected and cared for, and it was such an unexpected gift that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. When they reached the cabin, Samuel laid her gently on his bed and covered her with every blanket he owned. He built up the fire until the cabin was warm and cozy, then settled into the chair beside the bed, his large frame uncomfortable in the small seat but determined to stay close. "Sleep," he urged gently. "Rest and heal. Tomorrow will come whether we're ready or not, but you need to be strong to face it." Grace's eyes were already drifting closed, exhaustion finally claiming her. "Thank you, Samuel," she whispered. "Thank you for everything, for finding me, for helping me, for holding me. Thank you for tomorrow." "You're welcome, Grace," Samuel replied softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Sleep now. I'll be right here." As Grace fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, Samuel sat in his chair and watched over her, this broken stranger who had somehow in the space of a single day become important to him. He thought about grief and loss, about the ways life could shatter a person and the ways they could be put back together. He thought about his own years of isolation, his own running from pain, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was the universe's way of telling him it was time to stop running. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the February wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere an owl called. Samuel pulled his chair closer to the bed and settled in for a long night of watching, of protecting, of being present for someone who needed him. Tomorrow would come, as it always did. But they would face it together. The next several days passed in a blur of quiet moments and careful healing. Grace remained at Samuel's cabin, too weak and too emotionally shattered to consider returning to town. Samuel cared for her with a tenderness that surprised them both, bringing her food and water, helping her walk when her legs grew stronger, sitting with her through the long hours when grief would overwhelm her again. They talked during those days, long conversations that stretched from morning to night. Grace told Samuel about her childhood in St. Louis, about her mother who had died when Grace was 12, about her father who had remarried and had a new family that didn't include her. She told him about her dreams of having her own family someday, of belonging somewhere, of being loved. Samuel shared his own story in return, telling Grace about growing up in Texas, about learning to trap and hunt from his father, about meeting Mary at a church social, and knowing immediately she was the one. He told her about Jacob, his son, about the boy's laugh and his curiosity and his love of horses. He told her about the fever that had taken them, about the years of grief and anger that had followed, about finally fleeing to the mountains to escape memories that haunted every corner of his old life. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Grace asked one afternoon as they sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Samuel considered the question. "I used to think it saved my life coming here, getting away from everything, but now I wonder if maybe it just postponed the living. I've existed here for 10 years, but I haven't really lived. I haven't let myself feel anything or connect with anyone. I've just been surviving. And now," Grace prompted softly. "Now I think maybe it's time to do more than survive," Samuel said, his dark eyes meeting hers. "These past few days, taking care of you, being needed, it's reminded me that there's more to life than just getting through each day. There's purpose in connection. There's meaning in caring for someone else." Grace felt her heart skip at the intensity in his gaze. "You've saved my life, you know. If you hadn't found me that morning, I don't know what would have happened. I might have just laid down in that dirt and given up." "You wouldn't have," Samuel said firmly. "You're stronger than you think, Grace Thorne. You've survived things that would break most people. You would have found your way." "Maybe," Grace conceded. "But I'm grateful I didn't have to. I'm grateful you were there." A week after Hope's burial, Grace was strong enough to walk up the mountain to visit the grave. Samuel accompanied her, carrying a small cross he had carved from pine wood. He had burned Hope's name into it along with the date, February 14, 1876. When they reached the spot, Grace knelt and traced her fingers over the carved letters, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you for making this for her." Samuel planted the cross firmly in the ground at the head of the grave. "Every child deserves to be remembered." They sat together for a long while, Grace talking to Hope, telling her about the cabin and about Samuel and about the beauty of the mountains. Samuel listened quietly, giving Grace space for her grief while remaining close enough to offer comfort. On the walk back down, Grace slipped on some loose rocks and Samuel caught her, his strong hands gripping her waist to steady her. For a moment they stood frozen, Grace's hands on his broad chest, his hands warm through the fabric of her borrowed clothes. Their eyes met and something passed between them, a spark of awareness, of possibility. Samuel cleared his throat and carefully released her. "Careful. The path's treacherous here." "Thank you," Grace said softly, her cheeks flushing slightly. They continued down in silence, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the attraction growing alongside their friendship. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Grace finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "I should probably return to town soon. I've imposed on you long enough, and I need to get back to work at the store. Mrs. Patterson must be worried about me." Samuel felt his chest tighten at the thought of Grace leaving, of returning to his solitary existence. "You haven't imposed at all. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." "That's kind of you," Grace said, studying his face. "But I can't hide up here forever. I have responsibilities, a life to rebuild." "I understand," Samuel said, though everything in him wanted to argue, wanted to convince her to stay. "But maybe I could come with you. Into town, I mean. Make sure you get settled properly. Grace looked surprised. "You do that?" "I thought you avoided town." "I do," Samuel admitted, "or I did. But things change, people change." "Because of me?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel met her eyes, his expression serious. "Yes, because of you, Grace. These past 10 days, they've meant something to me." "You've meant something to me. I know the circumstances were terrible. I know you've been through hell, but having you here taking care of you, it's made me realize how much I've been missing. How much I want more than just solitude." Grace's breath caught. "Samuel, I don't know what to say. You've been so wonderful to me, so kind and patient and strong. But I'm a mess right now. My heart is broken, my life is complicated, and I don't know who I am anymore or what I want." "I'm not asking you to know," Samuel said gently. "I'm just telling you how I feel. I'm telling you that you don't have to face whatever comes next alone. I want to be there if you'll let me." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but for the first time in days, they weren't entirely tears of sadness. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of caring about someone again, of trusting again. The last time I did that, it ended badly." "I'm not him," Samuel said firmly. "I'm not going to lie to you or use you or abandon you. I'm a simple man, Grace. What you see is what you get. I live in these mountains. I make my living hunting and trapping, and I don't have much to offer except honesty and loyalty, and these two hands willing to work hard for the people I care about." "That's more than most men offer," Grace said softly. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her smaller fingers intertwining with his larger ones. "I care about you too, Samuel, more than I thought I could care about anyone right now. But I need time. I need to grieve hope, need to figure out how to move forward. Can you give me that?" "All the time you need," Samuel promised, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here or in town or wherever you need me to be. No pressure, no expectations. Just let me be part of your life. Let me help you face tomorrow." Grace smiled through her tears. "Tomorrow. You keep promising me tomorrow." "Because tomorrow always comes," Samuel said. "And it's not as scary when you face it with someone beside you." They sat there holding hands, the fire crackling before them, both aware that something profound was beginning to grow between them. It was fragile and uncertain, born from tragedy and grief, but it was real and honest and full of possibility. 2 days later, Samuel and Grace made the journey into Oro Blanco. Samuel rode his sturdy buckskin horse while Grace sat before him on the saddle, his arms bracketing her on either side as he held the reins. The ride took several hours, winding down from the mountains and across the high desert terrain that characterized this part of Arizona territory. As they approached the town, Grace grew increasingly nervous. "What will people think?" she asked. "Me showing up with you after disappearing for nearly 2 weeks. Let them think what they want," Samuel said firmly. "You don't owe anyone explanations." But Grace's worries proved somewhat unfounded. When they arrived at the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson, a stout woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, rushed out to greet them with obvious relief. "Grace, thank heavens you're all right. I've been worried sick." She pulled Grace into a tight hug the moment Samuel helped her down from the horse. "When you didn't come back that morning, I didn't know what to think. I had some of the men search for you, but the trails were cold." "I'm sorry I worried you," Grace said, returning the hug. Something happened. Something terrible, but Mr. Xavier here, he helped me." Mrs. Patterson looked at Samuel with sharp, assessing eyes. "Samuel Xavier, I've heard of you, the hermit who lives up in the mountains." "Yes, madam," Samuel said, removing his hat respectfully. "I found Grace when she needed help. I've been making sure she was cared for." Something in his tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation because Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. She looked between them, seemed to make some calculations, and then nodded. Well then, I'm grateful to you, Mr. Xavier. Grace is a good girl, works hard, never complains. We've been missing her at the store. I can come back to work, Grace said quickly. I know I've missed nearly 2 weeks. I'll make up the time, I promise. Mrs. Patterson waved her hand dismissively. Don't you worry about that right now. You just got back. Take a day or two to settle, then we'll talk about work. She paused, her eyes kind. Are you all right, dear? You look like you've been through something difficult. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I will be with time, Mrs. Patterson seemed to understand that this wasn't the moment for detailed questions. Well, come inside. Let's get you settled. Will you be staying, Mr. Xavier? Samuel glanced at Grace, who gave him a small nod. If there's room, I'd appreciate a place for the night. I want to make sure Grace is settled before I head back up. We've got space, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. Come along then, both of you. The boarding house was a 2-story building with a wide front porch, simple but well-maintained. Mrs. Patterson showed Samuel to a small room on the first floor while Grace climbed the stairs to her own room on the second floor. Before they separated, Samuel caught Grace's hand. I'll be right downstairs if you need anything, he said quietly. Thank you, Grace replied, for everything. That evening, Mrs. Patterson served dinner in the communal dining room. Several other boarders were present, including 2 minors, a clerk who worked at the assay office, and a young schoolteacher named Margaret. They were all curious about Grace's return and about the imposing mountain man who had brought her back, but Samuel's quiet, serious demeanor and Grace's obvious fragility kept the questions minimal. After dinner, Samuel and Grace walked through the town together. Oro Blanco was a small but growing settlement, with a main street lined by a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church, and various other establishments. The evening air was cool, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. It feels strange to be back in civilization, Samuel admitted. I haven't spent much time in town in years. Does it bother you? Grace asked. Being around people. Not as much as I thought it would, Samuel said. Especially not with you beside me. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, nodding to the few townspeople they passed. Eventually they found themselves at the small white church at the edge of town. Grace stopped, looking at the simple building with its modest steeple. You think God is angry with me? She asked quietly. For Hope, Samuel was startled by the question. Why would God be angry with you? For getting pregnant out of wedlock, for being foolish, for failing to keep my baby safe? Grace's voice broke on the last words. No, Samuel said firmly, turning to face her. Grace, listen to me. What happened to Hope was a tragedy, but it wasn't a punishment. These things happen sometimes, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. God isn't sitting up there punishing young women for being human, for wanting love, for making mistakes. If God works the way I think he does, he's mourning Hope right alongside you, and he's proud of you for being strong enough to keep going. You really believe that? Grace asked, tears shining in her eyes. I do, Samuel said. I lost my faith for a while after Mary and Jacob died. I was so angry at God for taking them. But over the years, I've come to believe that bad things happen not because God wills them, but because life is fragile and unpredictable. What matters is how we respond, how we help each other through the hard times. And that's where I see God, in the kindness and compassion we show each other. Grace stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Samuel's waist, pressing her face against his broad chest. He held her gently, one hand coming up to stroke her hair. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for helping me see things differently. Thank you for being here. Always, Samuel promised. They stood there in the shadow of the church as the last light faded from the sky, holding each other, drawing strength and comfort from their connection. Over the next several weeks, a pattern developed. Samuel would come into town every few days, bringing furs to trade at the general store and supplies to stock his cabin. He would always visit Grace, sometimes taking her for walks, sometimes just sitting with her on the boarding house porch and talking. Grace returned to work at the general store, though her employer, Mr. Henderson, was understanding about her needing to take breaks when grief overwhelmed her. The townspeople began to notice the mountain man's regular appearances and his obvious interest in Grace. There was some gossip, of course, speculation about what had happened during those weeks Grace had been gone, but for the most part people were kind. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a fierce defender, shutting down cruel rumors before they could spread too far. Spring came early to Arizona that year. By mid-March, wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the desert and up in the mountains. Samuel and Grace made the journey to Hope's grave, carrying seeds and small plants to decorate the spot. They spent the afternoon there, Grace talking to her daughter while Samuel planted flowers that would bloom year after year. She would have loved flowers, Grace said, watching Samuel work. I would have taught her the names of all of them. You still can, Samuel said gently. Tell her now. Tell her about these lupines and these desert marigolds. So Grace did, kneeling by the small grave and speaking softly about each plant Samuel placed in the ground. It was healing in a way she hadn't expected, this act of beautifying her daughter's resting place, of making it a living memorial. As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Grace turned to Samuel. I want to tell you something. All right, Samuel said, giving her his full attention. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past weeks, Grace began. About what happened, about hope, about my life and where it's going, and I've realized something important. Samuel waited, his heart beating faster. I've realized that I was so focused on what I lost that I almost missed what I found, Grace continued. You, Samuel, I found you, or you found me. Either way, you came into my life at the worst possible moment, and you've been nothing but kind and patient and strong. You've helped me through the darkest time I've ever faced, and you haven't asked for anything in return. I didn't help you because I wanted something back, Samuel said quietly. I know, Grace said, stepping closer to him. That's part of what makes you so special. But Samuel, I want you to know that I'm ready now. Ready to stop being so scared. Ready to trust again. Ready to see where this thing between us might go. Samuel's breath caught. Grace, are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured or think you owe me anything. I don't feel pressured, Grace assured him. I feel hopeful. For the first time since losing hope, I feel like maybe there's still a future worth living for. And I want you to be part of that future, if you still want to be. In answer, Samuel cupped Grace's face gently in his large, calloused hands and leaned down to kiss her. It was soft and sweet and full of promise, a kiss that tasted of tears and hope and new beginnings. Grace's arms came up to wrap around his neck, her fingers threading through his long, dark hair. And for a moment the world fell away, and there was only the two of them on that mountain, surrounded by beauty and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together. I want to court you properly, Samuel said. I want to do this right. No rushing, no assumptions, just two people getting to know each other and building something real. I'd like that, Grace said with a smile that lit up her entire face. They rode back to town that evening with Grace wrapped in Samuel's arms, both of them feeling lighter than they had in weeks. The future was still uncertain, still scary in some ways, but they would face it together. Samuel's courtship of Grace became the talk of Oro Blanco. The mountain man who had avoided civilization for a decade was suddenly a regular fixture in town, and his devotion to Grace was obvious to everyone. He would meet her after work at the general store, carrying her basket as they walked back to the boarding house. He would sit with her at church on Sundays, his large frame filling the pew, his deep voice joining in the hymns. He would bring her small gifts, a perfect pine cone, a piece of turquoise he had found in the mountains, a rabbit he had cleaned and dressed for Mrs. Patterson to cook. Grace bloomed under his attention. The haunted look began to fade from her eyes, replaced by growing happiness. She laughed more, smiled more, engaged with the world around her with renewed interest. She still had hard days, moments when grief would wash over her unexpectedly, but Samuel was always there, ready to hold her, to listen, to remind her that she was strong enough to survive anything. One evening in early May, Samuel took Grace to a small meadow just outside of town. He had brought a blanket and a basket of food, and they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I've been thinking," Samuel said, his fingers intertwined with Grace's, "about the future. About what I want my life to look like." "And what do you want?" Grace asked, turning to look at him. "I want you," Samuel said simply. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, have children with you if God blesses us that way, grow old with you. I want to be your husband, Grace, if you'll have me." Grace's eyes widened, her heart racing. "Samuel, are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," Samuel said, shifting to kneel before her. "I know we've only known each other a few months. I know you've been through terrible loss and that part of your heart will always belong to hope. But I love you, Grace Thorne. I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love the way you face each day even when it's hard. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you see beauty in small things. I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, protecting you, cherishing you. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Grace's face, but she was smiling, smiling so wide it almost hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you. I love you too. I didn't think I could love anyone again, but you've shown me that my heart is bigger than I knew. You've shown me that it's possible to grieve and hope at the same time. Yes, I want to be your wife." Samuel pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply, pouring all his love and devotion into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. "I don't have a ring," Samuel admitted, "but I'll get you one, the finest one I can afford." "I don't need a ring," Grace said. "I just need you." "You'll have both," Samuel promised. "You'll have everything I can give you." They were married 3 weeks later in the small white church in Oro Blanco. Grace wore a simple dress that Mrs. Patterson and the other boarding house residents had helped her make, white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried wildflowers from the mountains, the same kinds that grew on Hope's grave. Samuel wore new clothes purchased specially for the occasion, though he still looked more comfortable in his usual buckskins. His long hair was neatly tied back, and he had trimmed his beard for the occasion. The church was full of townspeople, many of whom had grown fond of the unlikely couple. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, beaming like a proud mother. Mr. Henderson from the general store was there, along with Margaret the schoolteacher, and many of the miners and merchants who made up Oro Blanco's small population. The preacher, Reverend Collins, performed a simple but beautiful ceremony. When it came time for Samuel to say his vows, his deep voice was steady and sure. "Grace, I promise to love you and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to be faithful, to be honest, to work hard to provide for our family. I promise to hold you through the hard times and celebrate with you through the good. I promise to honor your past, including the daughter you lost, and to build a future with you that honors her memory." You are my heart, my home, my tomorrow. I love you. Grace's vows were spoken through happy tears. Samuel, you found me at my lowest point and you didn't turn away. You held me through my grief and you promised me tomorrow. Every day since, you've kept that promise. I promise to love you with everything I have, to be your partner and your friend, to build a life with you based on honesty and trust and deep, abiding love. You've given me hope again, and I promise to spend the rest of my life showing you how grateful I am for that gift. I love you with all my heart. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Grace with such tenderness that many in the congregation wiped away tears. It was a kiss that spoke of second chances and new beginnings, of love born from tragedy and strengthened by shared grief. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson had organized a feast, and there was music and dancing. Samuel, who had rarely socialized in the 10 years he had lived in the mountains, found himself laughing and talking with townspeople, his arm always around Grace, keeping her close. As the evening drew to a close, Samuel and Grace said their goodbyes and rode out toward the mountains. Samuel had spent the past weeks preparing the cabin for his bride, building additions to make it larger and more comfortable. He had constructed a separate bedroom, added shelves and storage, even built a real bed frame with a mattress stuffed with fresh pine needles and soft grasses. When they arrived at the cabin under the light of a full moon, Samuel dismounted and then lifted Grace down from the horse, cradling her in his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," he said softly. Grace's smile was radiant. "Home," she repeated, tasting the word. "I've never really had a home before." "Not a real one." "You do now," Samuel promised, carrying her across the threshold. "This is your home for as long as you want it. We can always build something bigger, something different if you prefer." "This is perfect," Grace said, looking around at the familiar space, now enhanced with thoughtful touches. Curtains on the windows, a new table and chairs, fresh flowers in a jar. "You've made it beautiful." "You make it beautiful," Samuel corrected, setting her gently on her feet. "You make everything beautiful." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, two wounded souls finally allowing themselves to be vulnerable with each other, to give and receive comfort and pleasure and love. Samuel was gentle with Grace, aware of all she had been through, and she responded to his touch with growing confidence and joy. They came together as husband and wife with reverence and passion, creating new memories to overlay the painful ones, finding healing in their physical and emotional intimacy. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the new bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, and talked about their dreams for the future. "I'd like children," Grace said quietly, her head resting on Samuel's broad chest. "If we're blessed that way. I know it might be scary after hope, but I'd like to try." "I'd like that too," Samuel said, his hand stroking her hair. "I'd love to have a family with you, sons or daughters or both, it doesn't matter to me, as long as they're healthy and they have you as their mother." "We'll tell them about hope," Grace said. "When they are old enough, we'll tell them they had a sister who watches over them." "We will," Samuel agreed. "She'll always be part of our family." They fell asleep in each other's arms, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, who had walked through fire and emerged stronger, who had learned that love could bloom even in the darkest soil. The months that followed were some of the happiest either of them had ever known. Grace took to mountain life with surprising ease, learning to hunt and trap alongside Samuel, tending a garden she planted near the cabin, preserving food for the winter months. Samuel, for his part, found joy in sharing his world with someone, in teaching Grace the skills he had honed over years of solitary living, in coming home each evening to find her waiting for him. They made regular trips to Hope's grave, keeping it tended and beautiful. Grace would talk to her daughter, telling her about their life, about Samuel, about the love that had grown from that terrible day. And while the grief never fully disappeared, it became something Grace could carry, integrated into her life rather than overwhelming it. In late August, Grace realized she was pregnant. The discovery brought a complicated mix of emotions, joy and terror, hope and fear. When she told Samuel, he held her close and promised that whatever happened, they would face it together. "I'm scared," Grace admitted. "What if something goes wrong again? What if I lose this baby too?" "Then we'll grieve together and we'll survive together," Samuel said firmly. "But Grace, you can't let fear steal the joy of this moment. You're carrying our child. That's a miracle, and we're going to celebrate it and hope for it and trust that this time things will be different." "You really believe that?" Grace asked. "I do," Samuel said. "I believe in you, in us, in the strength you've shown. And I believe this baby is going to be healthy and strong and perfect." Grace chose to believe him, or at least to try. As her pregnancy progressed, Samuel was attentive and protective, refusing to let her do any heavy work, accompanying her on walks, making sure she ate well and rested often. He talked to her growing belly, his deep voice telling their unborn child about the mountains and the animals and the mother who already loved them so much. When winter came, Samuel insisted they spend the coldest months in town, not wanting Grace to be isolated in the mountains if complications arose. They rented a small house on the edge of Oro Blanco, and Samuel took work at the blacksmith shop to earn extra money. It was strange for him to be living in town, to be surrounded by people constantly. But he did it without complaint because Grace's safety and comfort were more important than his own preferences. Dr. Warren, the town's physician, examined Grace regularly and pronounced her healthy and strong. "Everything looks good," he assured them. "The baby's growing well and you're handling the pregnancy beautifully. No reason to think this won't result in a healthy birth." His words gave them hope, but as Grace's due date approached in early April, both she and Samuel grew increasingly nervous. The closer it got, the more Grace was haunted by memories of Hope's stillbirth, of the terrible mourning in the wilderness. Samuel held her through her fears, his strength and calm helping to anchor her. "This is different," he would remind her. "You're stronger now. You're in town where there's help if you need it, and I'm here. I'm right here, and I'm not leaving." On April 12, 1877, just over a year after Hope's death and burial, Grace went into labor. It started in the early morning, gentle contractions that grew steadily stronger. Samuel sent for Dr. Warren and Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a mother to Grace, and then he settled beside his wife, holding her hand, murmuring encouragement. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. There were moments when fear threatened to overwhelm Grace, when she was sure history was repeating itself, but Samuel never wavered. He stayed by her side every moment, his strong presence giving her courage. "You can do this," he told her over and over. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." Finally, just after midnight, with a final tremendous effort, Grace delivered their baby. For one terrible, eternal moment, the room was silent. Grace's heart stopped, her eyes filling with tears, sure that her worst fears had come true, and then the baby cried. It was the most beautiful sound Grace had ever heard, a lusty, indignant wail that filled the room and her heart with overwhelming joy. She burst into tears, reaching for her child even as Dr. Warren finished the delivery. "It's a boy," the doctor announced with a wide smile. "A healthy, strong baby boy." Samuel was crying too, tears streaming down his weathered face as Dr. Warren placed the squalling infant on Grace's chest. He was perfect, red-faced and furious at being born, but absolutely perfect. Grace cradled him, her tears falling onto his wrinkled little face, hardly able to believe he was real, was alive, was theirs. "Hello, my love," she whispered. "Hello, my beautiful boy, I'm your mama, and this is your papa, we've been waiting for you." Samuel reached out a tentative finger, stroking his son's tiny hand, amazed when the baby's fingers curled around his much larger one. "He's perfect," Samuel breathed. "Grace, he's absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Grace asked, looking up at her husband. They had discussed names, but had been too superstitious to decide on one before the birth. Now, looking at their son, Samuel said quietly, "What about Jacob, after my son? And maybe hope for a middle name to honor your daughter." Grace's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Jacob Hope Xavier." "It's perfect. They're both with us this way, both part of our family." Over the next weeks, they settled into life as new parents. Jacob was a healthy, hungry baby who seemed determined to make up for his sister's silence with plenty of noise. Grace took to motherhood with a fierce protectiveness born from loss, while Samuel was a devoted father, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he changed diapers and soothed his son. They moved back to the mountain cabin when Jacob was a month old, both of them eager to return to their home. Grace found that being back in the mountains, where she and Samuel had first met, where they had built their love, brought her a deep sense of peace. That spring, they took Jacob to Hope's grave for the first time. The wildflowers Samuel had planted were in full bloom, covering the small grave in a riot of color. Grace knelt with her son in her arms, introducing him to his sister. "This is your big sister, Hope," she said softly. "She watches over you from heaven. She would have loved you so much. And we'll make sure you always know about her. Always remember that you had a sister who was loved." Samuel placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, the other reaching down to stroke Jacob's soft head. They stood together in the mountain meadow, a family joined by both presence and absence, by love and loss and the courage to keep hoping. As the years passed, their family grew. Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Mary after Samuel's first wife, when Jacob was 2. Then came another son, whom they named William, and finally another daughter, Sarah. Each pregnancy brought fear, each delivery anxiety, but each child was born healthy and strong, and Grace's confidence grew with each one. The cabin expanded with their family, Samuel building additions and extra rooms, creating a rambling, comfortable home filled with the sounds of children's laughter and play. Jacob grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the mountains and animals as much as his father. Mary was wild and free-spirited, always climbing trees and exploring. William was gentle and artistic, preferring to draw pictures of the landscape rather than hunt. Sarah, the baby, was sweet and loving, always ready with hugs and kisses. They told all the children about Hope from the time they were old enough to understand. They made regular visits to her grave, keeping it tended and beautiful, teaching their children that she was part of their family, even though they had never met her. The children grew up understanding that loss was part of life, but so was love and resilience and the courage to keep going. Samuel proved to be an incredible father, patient and kind, teaching his children about the land and the animals, about honesty and hard work and treating others with respect. Grace blossomed into a confident, joyful mother, her early grief transformed into deeper compassion and understanding. Together, they built a life of simple happiness, filled with hard work and deep love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel and Grace returned to the spot where he had first found her, beside that creek in the mountains. Their children were with Samuel's old friend Jake, a trapper who had become like family over the years, giving the couple a rare day alone together. "Do you remember that day?" Samuel asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders as they stood looking at the creek. "Every detail," Grace said quietly. "The worst and best day of my life." "How can it be both?" Samuel asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Because I lost hope that day," Grace explained. "And that will always be a grief I carry, but I also found you. You saved my life, Samuel. You held me when I was breaking apart and you put me back together. You promised me tomorrow and you've given me so many beautiful tomorrows." "You saved me too," Samuel said, turning to face her. "I was half dead, just existing in these mountains, cut off from everything and everyone. You reminded me what it meant to be alive. You gave me a reason to rejoin the world. You gave me a family, a purpose, a future worth living." They kissed there beside the creek, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of love and gratitude and 10 years of marriage. When they pulled apart, Grace smiled up at her husband. "I think Hope would be happy," she said. "I think she'd be glad that something so beautiful came from something so tragic. I think she'd love her brothers and sisters, and she'd be proud of the life we've built." "I think so too," Samuel agreed. "I think she's watching over all of us." They spent the afternoon in the mountains, walking the trails they had walked so many times before, remembering that terrible, wonderful day when their lives had intersected. As the sun began to set, they made their way to Hope's grave, now surrounded by mature wildflowers and a small garden Grace had created over the years. "We did it," Grace said, kneeling beside the grave. "We survived. We built a life. We created a family. Thank you for being part of that journey, sweet Hope. Thank you for bringing your papa and me together." Samuel knelt beside her, his arm around her waist. "She would have been 10 years old now," he said quietly, "playing with her brothers and sisters running through these mountains." "I know," Grace said. "I think about that sometimes, about who she would have been. But then I look at our children and I see pieces of her in all of them. Jacob has her serious expression. Mary has the auburn hair I imagined Hope would have. William has a gentleness I think she would have had. Sarah has, I don't know, a kind of light about her. Hope's there in all of them." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Finally, as darkness began to fall, they stood and made their way back toward home, toward the cabin filled with their children, toward the life they had built from ashes and grief. Years continued to pass in the rhythms of mountain life. The children grew, each finding their own path. Jacob, at 18, began working with his father full-time, learning the skills of hunting and trapping, eventually taking over much of the work as Samuel grew older. Mary, spirited and independent at 16, shocked everyone by deciding to become a teacher, studying with Margaret in town before taking a position at the school. William, at 14, showed such artistic talent that a wealthy patron from back east offered to sponsor his education, and he left to study art, promising to return home often. Sarah, at 10, was still her parents' baby, though she was growing into a kind and thoughtful young girl who loved to help Grace in the garden and with the cooking. Grace and Samuel aged gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. Samuel's hair turned gray and he moved a bit slower, but he was still strong and capable, his devotion to his family never wavering. Grace developed laugh lines around her eyes and silver in her auburn hair, but she remained beautiful, her strength and resilience shining through. They celebrated their 20th anniversary surrounded by their children, Jacob bringing his new wife Elizabeth, Mary traveling from the school where she taught, William coming home from his studies back east, and Sarah helping to prepare a feast. Friends from town made the journey up to the cabin, and there was music and dancing and joy. That night, as Grace and Samuel lay in bed, listening to the sounds of their home filled with family, Grace said quietly, "Did you ever imagine we'd have all this? That day you found me." "No," Samuel admitted. "I couldn't see past your pain, past trying to help you survive the next hour, the next day. I never imagined it would lead to this, to us, to this beautiful family." "Me neither," Grace said. "All I wanted that day was to die. I couldn't imagine ever feeling happy again. But you held me, and you promised tomorrow, and you kept that promise every single day." "I always will," Samuel said, kissing her forehead, "for however many tomorrows we have left." They lived many more years, watching their grandchildren arrive and grow, seeing their family expand in ways they had never dreamed. They grew old together on their mountain, surrounded by love and beauty, their bond never weakening. Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Grace beside him, holding his hand just as he had held hers through so many difficult times. She grieved him deeply, but also with gratitude for the 46 years they had shared. Grace lived several more years, moving into town to be closer to Mary and her family. She spent her final years telling her grandchildren and great-grandchildren stories about their grandfather, about the mountain man who had found a broken stranger and loved her back to wholeness. When Grace passed at the age of 81, her children honored her final request. They buried her on the mountain, beside Hope's grave and beneath the pine tree where Samuel had first brought her on that terrible, transformative day. A simple stone marked the spot, bearing both their names and a simple inscription. He promised her tomorrow. Together they built a lifetime. Their descendants continued to tend both graves, year after year, generation after generation, keeping the story alive of the mountain man and the woman he found crying over her stillborn child, of how he held her through grief and promised tomorrow, and of how that promise became a love story that lasted beyond death itself. The wildflowers continued to bloom each spring on that mountain ridge, a living reminder that even from the deepest grief, beauty and hope and love could grow. And in the quiet moments when the wind whispered through the pines, some swore they could still hear it, the sound of a promise being kept over and over, echoing through eternity. Hope's grave remained at the center of it all, the catalyst for a love that had transformed two broken people into a family, into a legacy, into a testament to the power of compassion and courage, and the simple act of holding someone through their darkest hour and promising them tomorrow.